Thank you so much. That's a absolutely brilliant, outstanding, wonderful, glorious presentation. I feel it is embodied. I think I'm going to explode. It's so rich. The implications are just bloody incredible. Just one little comment from me before I take questions from the audience, just in relation to this very last point. One of Freud's ideas about schizophrenic thinking, which hasn't been taken up much outside of psychoanalysis, is that the distinction between the word presentation and the object presentation collapses in psychotic thinking. So there's a prediction that could be very easily tested in terms of whether by an fMRI study, whether these bodily activations that the word evokes would be stronger in the schizophrenic than the non-schizophrenic. It's fucking wonderful. So who wants to ask the first question of Professor Gallese? There we have a Katerina Fatopoulou who came all the way from London to listen to you. So it's good that she asks first. If I can get this to switch on.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Indeed, for the wonderful, very sophisticated talk. A really simple question on your hypothesis on how mirror neurons work. So if, let's say, the domain of motor cognition, so if we have motor consonant with another while observing somebody else move, I want to just reverse the question a bit and think, what happens when we move to these mirror neurons? Are we supposed to have a mirror function at that moment? And if we do, what does it do in the brain? You know, does it inform consciousness? When I move my hand, am I anticipating? Am I somewhat observing? Or am I ready that somebody else is doing the same movement or something of the kind? And if not, is that activation inhibited or what happens to it?
That's a very good point. Thank you. Well, by definition, we would not be able to define a neuron as a mirror neuron if it is inhibited when the possessor of the neuron acts. So they normally are active when my mirror neuron fire or when I act. It turns out, both in the monkey, it's a paper which appeared early this year from the group of Roger Lemon at UCL, and I was really enormously happy because mirror neurons made it through the channel finally, and because one of the jokes I was exposed for many years, how comes that only Italian can record mirror neurons? Now finally even chaps in the UK do it, that's good. But they moved one step forward, so they describe a quarter of this neuron, which happened to be a corticospinal neuron, by the way, because Roger Lemon has been very careful in studying the cortical contribution to the top-down modulation of the motor spinal cord. So these mirror neurons send their axons into the spinal cord, and about a quarter in this sample are excited when the monkey grasps, but are inhibited when the monkey witnessed the grasp of someone else. And the very same inhibitory modulation was described by Jacoboni and Fried in their own paper. So it turns out that it's difficult to make a quantitative estimate, but certainly part of our mirror neurons are inhibited when we are witnessing the behavior of others. And a disinhibition of these inhibited mirror neurons could perhaps explain some pathological behavior like echopraxia, where you feel compelled to imitate what you are exposed to. And it is also possible that the sharp transition from neonatal imitation to more adult type of imitation is the development of inhibitory top-down control, which turns a kind of compelled imitation into a motor simulation. So that's the idea.
Maggie Zollner.
Thank you for such a great talk. So I was thinking about how one of the central points that you're making and that these systems have to do for us is to be able to understand what the other is feeling without feeling what the other is feeling and making that distinction. And so that made me think of several psychodynamic processes that we work with a lot, and a lot of us work with personally, which is the extent to which someone else's feelings really feel like our feelings, and then especially the complicated aspect of when we think that someone else is having feelings about us, and then those become our feelings. So if we imagine an important person is feeling disapproval, for example, we could feel that on some very deep level. And so it seemed like in terms of two of the components that you talked about were probably very key for those processes. And one is the intensity of activation in some of these areas are going to determine how much I feel like your feelings matter to me. And then also patterns of activation and deactivation that allow me to not feel so overwhelmed by what your feelings are. So a child who experiences the mother being frightened, that can be very scary. The child who experiences the mother feeling disgusted is also very painful. So I just wanted to know if you had some further thoughts about the developmental aspect of that.
Yeah. From one point of view, I think the metaphor of mirroring can be misleading, because a mirror normally reflects whatever you put in front of the mirror. So what determining what the mirror reflects is not the intrinsic quality of the mirror, but what you put in front of the mirror. Here we are dealing with biological mirrors. So there is preliminary evidence, but very suggestive evidence, that this mechanism is not a Pavlovian reflex, but keeps tracks of our own personal history. And one key aspect of the future research is to study individual differences, personality profiles, how personality profile translate into different activation pattern of this mechanism. And there are colleagues of mine who started investigating, for example, empathy for pain, in a cohort of healthy individuals that nevertheless can be described very differently in terms of their own proclivity to inwardness or to outwardness. And the results are really astonishing. I mean, you see, in one group you see the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. In the other group you don't see anything down there. You see a very strong activation of visual areas. So apparently they can recognize the pain in the face of the partner. They can rate the intensity of the experienced pain. So apparently they do empathize, but just with words. Definitely not with the very same brain region that turns out to be active in the more inward prone individuals. So this is the beginning. I think we should more and more, I mean, we are providing a incredibly oversimplified version of what a human being is. It is kind of average brain belonging to an average human being that doesn't exist, of course. We are forced to do that because of our methodological reductionism, but there's a large room for improving the level of the granularity of our investigation. So the developmental aspect is also very important. Something I didn't have time to mention is that a recent science paper was studying a dimension of mirroring we didn't investigate at the beginning, namely the distance between the agent and the observer. And it turns out that mirror neurons are sensitive to that. So there are mirror neurons that fire exclusively if the observed action occurs outside the peripersonal space of the observer, or conversely only if that observed action occurs within the peripersonal space. So think about an intrusive mother who constantly violates the peripersonal space of the child, and how this possibly can affect the responsiveness of the brain of the child to observe action or action charged with emotional value just because of this systematic violation of peripersonal space. So there's a lot of things to be investigated, I think.
Siri Hustvedt.
Aside from the nod to my book that made me very, very happy because I'm a great admirer of yours, and maybe you noticed a rather long footnote about that. I'm interested, though, in asking about this very interesting implicit and explicit body ownership task. Yeah. And it seems to correspond, even if it's a little murky, with Sean Gallagher's body image and body schema differentiation. And what I want to know is what you think is the role of language in the explicit task. How is this affecting the differentiation? It's obviously bringing in different brain areas, probably the prefrontal cortex. And what is actually happening?
That's a big question. I wish I could answer your question. Well, I would say that definitely language plays probably a very important role in guiding our body-related memories. So it provides a coherent temporal or spatial framework where we can locate body-related experiences which build up along with the development of our life personal history and life experience. This implicit advantage is clearly non-linguistic. I mean, you do need to go through a linguistic mediation. Actually, the more you make explicit the question about ownership, the less you profit of this implicit motor representation. And I'm speaking explicitly of a motor representation because we have a new study. I didn't want to annoy you too much with unpublished data, but we ran a mental rotation task. So this time we are asking participants, tell me if what you see is a right hand or a left hand. And we show right and left hand at different angles. And since the mid-80s, the work of Parsons, it turns out that the more the image is deviated from the standard canonical position, the more it takes you time to tell whether it is a right or a left hand. Because what you do is to realign, mentally rotate the hand to realign it with the canonical position it normally occupies. And again, we are finding an advantage for hands belonging to the self in this motor rotation task. So we believe this implicit representation is motor. What's shown has not yet made enough explicit is exactly this motor dominant dimension of the body schema. So the body schema traditionally has been taken as a variety of brain circuits that give you the opportunity to be a non-conscious, skillful individual. So you are a zombie, cognitively speaking, but you don't move like a zombie. So the idea is that is much richer what this body schema can buy you. And the prevalent dimension of this body schema-related circuit is the motor dimension. That's the idea. So the body image is a linguistic construction that can be dissociated, completely dissociated from this implicit knowledge of our body. In a variety of neuropsychological cases, part of which you discuss yourself in your book, like the alien hand, the rubber hand illusion, the anarchic hand, and so on.
Bob Schaff.
Thank you very much for the lecture and all the work you and your colleagues have done. I wanted to ask you specifically about the inferior prefrontal gyrus and specifically Brodmann area 45. It's been suggested in the literature that this is the primary node of the entire mirror system and a linked node to the insula and to the drivers of the autonomic nervous system. Do you also think that this area is a primary node? And since there's been things written having to do with the uniqueness of that area for developmental mouth representation, hand representation, as well as semantic, it's very evocative to speculate about this extraordinary area.
Yeah, thank you for your question. That's also very, very interesting. To be honest, well, first of all, there is a variety of results when it comes to the border of the anterior border of the activation pattern that can be evoked in the human brain of healthy controls when both executing or observing correlated motor acts performed by hands, for example. So in some study you see ventral area 6 and 44, in some other you see 44 and 45, in some other you see area 6 and 45 but not 44. The problem is that with the spatial resolution of fMRI and the huge inter-individual variability in the cytoarchitectonic borders between these areas, the Vogt Institute for Neuroanatomy in Stuttgart and Carl Zillers, who chairs this institute, are in the middle of building an automatized cytoarchitectonic brain atlas of the human brain. So they came up with quantitative criteria. They systematically study the cytoarchitectonics of 100 human brains, and then on the basis of this quantitative database, they draw cytoarchitectonic borders. So it's like Brodmann, but instead of having Brodmann describing one single brain, they do it with 100 brains. And it turns out that if you want to draw the cytoarchitectonic, so merely anatomical borders of Broca's region, 44 and 45, the interindividual variability is in the order of 30%. 30. So when you see an activation spot, is it 44, 45? It's really hard to tell. So this is my hook to say, I don't know, to your question.
Michael Trupp.
Wonderful lecture. As soon as I say what to do. It was a wonderful lecture. And there's so many questions that it provokes. But I wanted to mention that there, kind of by historical accident, there is already a sort of application to mirroring concepts by an analyst called Heinz Kohut, who formed a methodology and a theory building about very early mother-infant interactions involving a self-object, in his term, with variations in the transference involving what he called mirroring and alter ego experience and twinship as subtle gradations of the experience of early formative self-object experience. And very interesting. He would be very happy to be alive today and have this confirmation. There was one other comment I want to make, this sort of peripheral, and it has to do with the insula.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people are aware of how much brain space the insula occupies. It's shocking. And when I was in medical school, nobody really knew what it was about.
Yeah.
It was just a chunk of brain meat. And now we're seeing increasingly that it seems to be a coordinate of self-experiences at all physiologic levels.
Yes.
Yeah.
And indeed, we have been systematically exploring the insula in the macaque monkey brain by means of intracortical microstimulation. And by the way, this is another paper that got rejected by Nature. we haven't managed to publish it yet. And I think we made quite interesting discoveries there, because nowadays a very much discussed hypothesis is that the anterior insula, at least in the human brain, would be a sort of meta-representation of the bodily self. At least this is made very explicit in Bart Craig ideas. And I'm afraid that this makes of the insula a kind of revisited version of Descartes' pineal gland. Because there is this idea of meta-representation which always stems from a recursive level of representation which nevertheless has a very strong sensory or passive connotation, while by directly stimulating the entire extension of the insula in the macaque monkey brain. At least we found a lot of motor evoked behavior. And we could even demonstrate that a given behavior which has a clear emotional status can be dramatically altered by stimulating selective location in the insula only within a social context. So it's not sufficient to inject electrical current in that particular spot in the insula, but the effect can be evoked only if the monkey is facing someone. If the experimenter is turning the head away from the monkey you stimulate, you don't see anything. So, yeah.
One final request. Would you say a word or two about autism? About the...
Yeah, okay. Autism, it's a very tricky issue. I never said, and I don't subscribe to the idea that autism simply squares with broken mirror neurons. This is an oversimplified view I don't subscribe to. I never thought about that. What drove me first, merely from a theoretical point of view, to approach the problem of autism was the fact that I couldn't reconcile the mainstream view of autism as mind blindness or lack of theory of mind with what high-functioning autistic individual or Asperger individual were telling about their own experience as being an Asperger or like temple grounding. So the picture that came out from their own self-report was clearly miles away from the mainstream view that you become autistic because you are poor in mentalizing, and mentalizing by relying on a theoretical approach to the mind of the other. So my gut feeling was that there was this pre-verbal dimension of intersubjectivity in autism that was not explored enough. And so mirror neuron could provide a link to a new investigation of this pre-verbal dimension. And indeed, there is a variety of papers showing either lower activation of the mirror neurons when observing action of someone else. Ramachandran group was the first to describe that, but it's not an all or nothing. Interestingly, the very same group demonstrated that if the observed agent is the mother, mirror neurons do activate. So, so there is most likely an emotional gating of this kind of motor resonance, which is also very interesting from a therapeutic point of view. But we published a paper this year on altered connectivity in anterior and posterior insula in highly functioning autistic individuals. So in our sample, these patients showed disrupted connectivity between the anterior insula and the amygdala, and posterior insula and the somatosensory cortex. And we believe that this altered connectivity between anterior insula and the amygdala could perhaps explain why these individuals systematically fail to look at the eyes of the interlocutor. Because if you have a bilateral lesion of the amygdala, like the patients described by Damasio and colleagues, these patients originally were thought to be fear blind because they fail systematically in recognizing fear while they're very good in recognizing other forms of emotions. But the same group of researchers recently re-examined this patient, and they discovered that if they were forced to look at the periorbital region of faces, which is the most telling when you are supposed to recognize fear, they were as good as controls. So this bilateral lesion of the amygdala clearly has an impact on where this patient look at the human face, which is systematically observed also in autistic individuals. So this altered connectivity between the amygdala and the anterior insula could be part of the story. So it's not only motor resonance, it's a very complex psychopathological state with people that go from being permanently nonverbal to becoming PhD, writing books on their own being autistic. So is very difficult. I don't think a unilateral perspective can explain the overall spectrum, the large phenotype of autism, but certainly the things I've been dealing with today are worthwhile being thoroughly explored in this patient, because they weren't up to a few years ago.
Bo. Heather Berlin.
Yeah.
One is this lack of deactivation of the posterior insular cortex, and then therefore the lack of differentiation between self and other. I was interested if you're going to explore that in other sensory modalities. For example, some patients have preventations that they're emitting an odor, so that this lack of differentiation between is it internally generated or externally generated, let's say olfactory or auditory, so they think thoughts are coming from being inserted, so that this lack of differentiation between self and other can seep into these other sensory modalities. And I was interested if you
No, so far we haven't investigated the modalities you were referring to, although it would be very interesting to do it. We just completed another study on the same group of patients, first episode, psychotic patients, where we injected the emotional dimension in action. So we show them video clips where they saw different actors grasping the very same objects, but with different emotional expressions. And in controls, we see a modulatory effect on motor resonance. And we are about to analyze this data also in psychotic patients. And we run a behavioral task on the relationship between the motor system and language. So we submitted them to sentences describing actions, and also these data are yet to be analyzed. Yeah.
The second question is this sort of clumsy explicit system that seems to be poorer at distinguishing self and other than the implicit system.
Yeah.
What do you think then the advantage of this explicit system is? Because you do many things better without, using these things.
With implicit advantage, I think it's the outcome of the necessity to entertain a very clear boundary of your own bodily self, which has clear advantages, for example, for movement control or for monitoring your relationship with the external world. And it makes a lot of sense to me that this advantage is not the outcome of an explicit self-reflection, but it's simply brought to you by the way your motor system is wired. You see what I mean?
I'm very sorry about the problems with the roving mic, but there's still quite a few questions. I'll carry on for 20 more minutes if you're willing. And there's a question from this chap in the blue shirt, then Dr. Hoffman, then Dr. Neves, and then I'll take more after that. Shout.
In your paper on the two sides of mimesis,
Yes.
you cite Girard's mimetic theory
Yeah.
as a way to explain violence, aggression, and scapegoating. That's a very curious piece of information. I'd love it if you could say more about that. What you think of it.
Yeah. Well, I think the idea of mimetic desire, which was put forward by Girard already in the mid-60s, I think, it's very interesting also for us, well, for a variety of reasons, but one reason is that it's urging a lot of prudence when people uses mirror neurons too quickly to make the bold claim, you see, now we finally understand why we are good-willed and sympathetic human beings, why we are altruistic just because we have mirror neurons in our brain, which is, I mean, I'm horrified when I read these statements because, I mean, the very same logic, I mean, the very same notion of mimesis and resonance can lead you to opposite results, as beautifully shown by Girard, independently from the fact that you buy the whole Girard package. I think Girard probably was not even completely explicit in his depth with respect to Hegel, Kojève, so the idea that what is really important, even before mimetic desire, is mimetic desire per se. So the object of your desire is the desire for social recognition, which is really Hegelian. I mean, it's, you don't need to bring in Girard to establish that. But nevertheless, Girard was very crucial in developing this idea and giving it a very strong cultural dimension, because he started from literature, but then he moved to anthropology, paleoanthropology, so as a kind of scholar who can move quite well in a variety of fields. So I had the opportunity to meet him, to discuss things with him. It was a small grant they had in Stanford. So for a couple of years, we were meeting for 1 week with him. Andy Meltzer was also part of this panel, the psychologist who discovered neonatal imitation. And so I think mimetic desire, if you want, can be explained in neural terms by relying to desire what is the target of someone else's desire. You first need to find out what the other is desiring. Why is he looking at a particular object and willing to acquire that object? And in that respect, I think the mechanism I've been dealing with, embodied simulation, is relevant. But the main reason why I wanted to address the topic of Girard was to establish that we shouldn't be so quickly ready to use mirror neurons to explain a variety of things which are, at the very least, highly debatable. It's only one side of mimesis, altruism, so to speak.
Leon Hoffman, please shout.
Thank you very much. You may have said this, and I didn't catch it. Are mirror neurons both perceptual receivers as well as motoric initiators, or are they more like a way station receiving affective input?
No, one neuron does both.
One neuron does both?
Yes, I mean, it fires when the monkey acts, and it fires when the monkey sees someone else acting. And the same turned out to be true in the human brain. Yeah.
Dr. Niemitz.
Could you comment on the question, particularly the nature of status in the course of depression, and those that are, say, psychotically depressed, and those who manage to manage it, also those who are pharmacologically treated, and what the effect is of pharmacology?
He wants to know if there's any evidence in relation to depression.
Not that I'm aware of. The main reason why we wanted to start investigation on schizophrenia with first episode patients was just to minimize the confounding possible effect of the pharmacological treatment. Because you will never know if what you are measuring is the outcome of the psychosis or the supervening impact of treatment. I'm not aware of studies carried out on depressed patients. We have an ongoing collaboration in London at the Anna Freud Institute with Peter Fonagy. We are studying. We started studying borderline patients, which is, I take it to be a very risky enterprise. We'll see. I mean, I don't know what affect regulation means, from my own point of view. So I'm interested to learn more. And we start with a very simple paradigm with high-density EEG, and we'll see. I'm very curious about this collaboration.
So the chap in the striped shirt and then you over there.
I wanted to clarify something as I understood it. The mirror neuron, there's a firing, whether the experience is something that you do or that you see.
Yeah.
So, and there are two other areas that fire. So in a way to oversimplify what I'm understanding is one information corresponds to this is happening, and then one of two other places can say this is happening inside your body or this is happening outside your body.
Yes.
So I am curious about what it is or what these areas of inside and outside are related to. What is it that gives the information to these areas of inside the body versus outside?
Well, this container-like metaphor, inside and outside, is multidimensional, certainly. So there is a quality, a dimensional quality, which is most likely affective, emotional, visceromotor, autonomic-like, and most likely posterior insula is a key area in that respect. Then there is a dimension which is more related to agency. And in that respect, probably the premotor cortex, which is a key area in integrating visual, somatosensory, and auditory signals related to your own body with the motor command that directs parts of your body in space, plays a major role as well. Yeah.
So where there is a little bit of a conundrum for me is because the information that's given by the mirror neuron, even if it's spoken, in a way is going to give you the feeling that it's as if it's happening in your body. And then what you're saying is so that coexists with other circuits that actually tell you, no, it's not.
Yeah. This is the closest approximation of what in our hands the data seem to suggest. Although, I mean, the language relationship to mirroring is quite complex. When you see someone doing something, say, grasping this glass, my motor system becomes activated as if I were grasping it. Although it is an as if. I don't have any tactile or proprioceptive feedback when I see you grasping this glass, which is clearly the case when I am the agent. When I read or listen to a sentence describing he grasped the cup, I still see my motor system being activated in an effector-specific way. Nevertheless, what I see is not an activation, but an inhibition, a suppression. Why do I have an activation when I see the hand, and why I have an effector-specific inhibition when I read? So the idea is that the linguistic description with respect to the visual description is underdetermined. When I see someone, I see a specific hand grasping a specific kind of glass in a specific way. But the very same glass could be grasped like this, or like this. So all this variety of motor representation are somehow conflated in the underdetermined or more general, if you want to see it the other way, linguistic mediation. So he grasped. So we don't know yet whether when we listen to such an expression, we refer to a prototypical kind of grasping. So if there is a canonical way of imagining a grasp when it is conveyed by the linguistic mediation, or rather we have a multiple activation of different motor representation which leads to a reciprocal inhibitory process which leads to the suppression we are measuring. We are still at the very beginning of this exploration of the to which extent the linguistic description and the bodily description overlap or not. So I really don't know.
The next question is over there.
I have a comment and then a question. The comment is sort of obvious that for us as therapists, of course, in the future, what would be most interesting is when you start to study not just pre-psychotic cases, but personality disorder. And you look at those patterns, for example, in the insula, and then what is inhibited. And the hope would be that this could be a way, a crude, perhaps, way of measuring progress.
Yes.
In analysis of therapy. Also, that very interesting last distinction between when the person is conscious of their own, trying to determine whether or not it's their own body versus not, and the advantage of not being conscious might have some implication for the optimum approach that the therapist takes in terms of conscious, sort of linguistically determined intent versus the sort of Ishikawa phenomenon of unconscious communication, although it's not an exact analogy.
Yeah.
And the question has to do with what your thoughts are on the evolutionary advantage of the development of the neuron.
Well, the developmental advantage is that you have a very quick way of making sense of what's going on around you without having to explicitly think about it.
I'm just wondering what the relationship is, it seems very obvious, maybe it's not, between Winnicott's failure of mirroring and failure of mirroring in the reverse sense. Psychoanalysts, of course, talk about the woman's failure in terms of her self-involvement, her narcissism, and so on. You would not use that language if there is a relationship indeed at all.
Well, I don't know if there is a relationship. If you ask me, it would make a lot of sense if we could demonstrate that there is a relationship. Because as I said, the mirroring and the mirrored are always linked in a reciprocal fashion. So what actually we are very soon going to measure, as much as we can, of course, with the limitation of the artificiality of this approach. Nevertheless, what we want to test is to which extent preconditioning the emotional relationship between agent and observer, we can see a modulatory effect on this mechanism. And in the mirroring between the mother, the sufficiently good mother is probably someone who is able to not just reflecting back what she received, but giving back a metabolized version of what she is able to reflect. And so that's why I said that the metaphors of the mirror is telling on the one hand, but totally misleading on the other.
Throughout the brain, and
Yeah. We know very little. What we know is that monkeys have it, humans have it, and singing birds have it. So there were two papers, one in Science, one in Nature, incredibly sophisticated neurophysiological papers, because believe me, recording single neurons in a singing bird, a moving singing bird, is a nightmare. And they were good enough to keep this neuron enough to record the firing both during production of the song and listening to a species-specific song. And so there is evidence of audiomotor mirror neurons in singing birds. Colleagues of mine were up to investigating the octopus, because octopus are very good imitator. I don't know about their mother-infant relationship, to be honest. No, it's not a joke, I don't know. But that dimension is very important. I would bet that dogs, so one dream experiment I would like to do is to brain scan domestic dogs, which would be much easier than brain scanning monkeys, by the way, because they can easily, in a very short timed experiment, I would expect the dog brain to show evidence of mirroring, especially if watching the master. Other species, I don't know. It seems to be pretty old, evolutionary speaking, because you see it in birds and then you see it in primates. What is in between, we don't know.
Thank you very much. I'm going to relieve you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Gallese, as you can see, we could have carried on for a lot longer. There was many more questions, which is testimony to the richness of your work. One last thing about mirroring function, which is that this slide is from us to you. Our next meeting is the first Saturday in November, and this is proof also that psychoanalytical institutes around the world can never catch up with technology, not even microphones. Thank you again, Professor Gallese. This is